Good evening. My name is Darryl Robert Schoon, and the purpose of this evening's show is to reveal the dynamics behind the reality that you see today. It is opaque, it is certainly not transparent, and that's for a reason. The elites that have the power and control in the United States and in the world don't want others to know what they are, what they're doing, and what they're up to. Because although it isn't working for the rest of the world, it is certainly working for themselves. There's a saying that's, it says, follow the money. And by sticking to this, I think we're going to find some very interesting perspectives on really what's going on following the money. Following the money will show us exactly who's doing what and what is happening and what we can expect to happen. Now, I want to say this to our viewers. None of us have the power to change what is going to happen on the collective scale, though we each have the power to change what's going to happen on our individual scale. Whether or not we do so is dependent on the belief in the power that we do have and the understanding of the power that those people have around us who control basically the factors in the collective reality. But I'm digressing now. Let's go back to the beginning of when this period started. Before the 1700s, money was essentially gold and silver all the way around the world. I mean, perhaps in some cultures they used shells, or even in England for a while they had something called a tally stick that was guaranteed by the government, and but it sufficed. But generally, money was gold and silver. It didn't matter where you were on the planet. Gold and silver were valuable. People would exchange the goods and services they had for whatever gold and silver they can get for it. Now, the basically underlying dynamic of all economies was supply and demand. The higher the demand was for a certain good, the higher the price it would obtain. The lower the demand, the less you could charge for it. As far as supply, the greater the supply, the lower the price. The more restricted the supply, the more scarce an item was, the higher the price. These are the basic dynamics of any economy anywhere in the world. Now, gold and silver acted as money. It was a sort of it was really truly a medium of exchange that was universally recognized the world over. Now, to come to where we are today, we have to go back to 1695, when two parties set the world as we know it in motion. And if you keep these two parties in mind, it will explain to you really why your world looks and acts the way it does. You may not understand it now. I'm hoping by the end of this program you will. The two parties that created the modern world, which started in 1695 in the early, 18th century, was first of all the bankers and government. Now, let's go before 1695. It was government that always determined what was so in the world in terms of power and in money. The prevailing government said this is money, whatever money was. They could stamp their gold coins or silver coins and pass it around as mediums of exchange. All right? And they determined who had the power in that society. This is government. All right? Now, bankers, which entered the equation in 1695, did not even exist as a term before 1695. But in 1695, not only did they come on the stage, they came on in a very insidious way where they now basically run the world. And governments are now stepmaidens to the bankers. Financial people who never even existed in terms of power before that time. Now, who were these people and what did they want to do? Basically, these people were goldsmiths that, that's where the bank came from, that used to loan money. All right, for people who needed it. There was not a lot of money in circulation at that time in terms of credit. All right, but these people made money by charging interest on the gold and silver that they loaned people. Simply, gold and silver, they loan it. They got the gold and silver back, plus more gold and silver as interest. All right. Now, I want you to understand what they did in 1695. In 1695, England created the first modern central bank. Now, they had a central bank in Sweden, a few, I don't know how many years before, but it wasn't a modern central bank in the terms that England's central bank is. England's central bank is a modern central bank in the sense that instead of issuing, it still issued silver and gold coins, all right, but what they really issued for the first time was paper money. Paper money allegedly backed by gold and silver. All right, why? Because the money that was issued at the Bank of England said redeemable in specie, which is gold and silver. All right, and it was. You could take these pieces of paper, go to the Bank of England, turn it in, and you would get your gold and silver. But the bankers knew that people would not do this, very rarely would do this. Maybe if they were traveling around the world and they needed gold and silver because the English pound notes weren't going to be really of much value anywhere else except where England ruled, they would take these pieces of paper, turn them into the Bank of England, get gold and silver, and go to wherever they went because they knew gold and silver was going to give them what they wanted wherever they went. All right? Now, why the bankers did this is that they knew most people would never turn in and exchange those pieces of paper. As long as they had confidence in that paper that they could do so, they would continue to use that paper. And this is where the bankers leveraged the system. This is why bankers became so powerful. Instead of backing, let's say, $1 million worth of paper with $1 million worth of gold and silver, so no, you have 1-to-1, you always have enough gold and silver to cover the paper. What the bankers did is that they would only cover by, let's say, 10 to 15 to 20%, maybe 30. All right? So for every let's say for every $100 in actual paper money that they had in circulation, they actually had $10 in silver or gold or whatever to cover it. All right? I call this emergency money. In the case that people got freaked out, or somebody needed their money on an overnight basis, they're going to travel, or a businessman needed it, they would have enough gold and silver around to turn it in to keep everybody cool. Now, what you can see here is basically the beginning of a fraud. All right? The people believed that there was gold and silver backing this paper money. The truth was there was never enough gold and silver. They just kept convenient amounts on hand to keep people's confidence that there was sufficient gold and silver to cover. Now, why they did this was that the bankers were then able to take these pieces of paper, allegedly fully backed by gold and silver, and loan it like real money. Loan it like real money. Before, they used to loan gold and silver and get interest back for that. Now they could take pieces of paper, okay, barely covered by negligible amounts of gold and silver. They thought it was enough, but truly it wasn't fully backed, and make interest on that new paper money. Now, to do this, they needed the complicity of a government to say these pieces of paper were money. And this is what England did. These finance people came to King William of England and made him a great offer. The offer is that, listen, we're going to pay off all your debts that you have, your considerable debts. All right? We'll loan you whatever money you want to go to war. And basically, government was all about power. They wanted power. All right? And power in those days had to do with war. So England became the most powerful country in the world because King William was able to borrow money from from the central bank, all right? And with this money, he built the world's most powerful navy. England is just a very small, little dinky country sitting up there, north and west of Europe, all right? Not that big. But within the next 100, 150 years, it basically took over the world. Why? Because England, the kings and queens in England could go to the bank, borrow money, all right, pay for a navy, all right, and as long as they could pay that loan back, they made bank. They could increase. Now, what did this mean? Why do they have to pay? What happened once you started putting interest at the basis of your money? If every pound note went out as a loan, and which it did. This is what central banks do. Money goes out as loans. All right? It is introduced into the economy as a loan. That's what your Fed fund rates is. That's the interest rate on the loan on money being produced by the central bank. This means the flow of money is dependent upon the rate of interest that they're charging. Now, that interest that they're charging compounds. It compounds constantly. All right? So the money that you borrow today, you're going to owe more tomorrow. The day after that, you're going to owe more than that. The day after that, you're going to owe more than that. The day after that, you're going to owe more than that. The day after that, you're going to owe more than that. This is the closest metaphor that we have of this is a drug addiction. If you do some heroin today, and you wake up tomorrow, you're going to need to do more heroin the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. Why? Because the need to satisfy the habit is going equally, commensurately every day. The need on the bankers, when their bankers' debt-based money came out, which is called capital. Debt-based money is capital. Capital did not exist, issued by bankers before England and the 1700s. All right? This is the beginning of capitalism. A market system whereby the money is now based upon debt-based money, capital, all right, on debt-based markets, capitalist markets where they bought and sold debt, they, all IOUs, all right, and this exploded. Now, this is a very, very powerful tool, but it's a dangerous tool, okay? It's like heroin. Heroin can kill all of the pain in the world, but it's a very, very dangerous drug because it is so effective, it is addicting. And because it is addicting, what that means is every moment, every year, every day, you need to do more and more and more to keep the consequences at bay. This metaphor is exactly what's going on with money. Because the debts, when money is issued as debt, as it is in capitalist systems, that debt compounds daily, yearly. It doesn't matter who borrows it. It doesn't matter if it's the lady down the street, the businessman for his corporation, the banker, the farmer to set in next year's crops, or government to fight a war. Okay? These debts compound constantly. So you're going to keep owing more and more and more. Now, England did handle this addiction to credit, to debt, very ably for, let's say, 150 years. How did they do this? Well, they did it by war. Now, King William borrowed the money, went to war, and England, after the end of 150 years, basically ruled the world. Britannia. The sun didn't set on the British Empire. All right? Why? Because they were able to borrow money on the come, take over all these different countries, all right? Suck the money out of that country, make those countries use their money as a medium of exchange, and they took these colonies. They didn't go across the world trying to make things better. The English went across the world trying to make things better for themselves, and they did. All right? Now, the rest of the world was sort of in shock. I mean, how did this little country all of a sudden start taking over the rest of the world? They thought, oh, they're smarter, they're harder working, they got industry, they got this stuff. Well, it really came down to their ability to leverage gold and silver as debt and push it out there. Their navy ruled the world. They were able to knock over country after country after country, suck those countries dry. All right, and so in England you had these vast manor houses. You had very wealthy Englishmen, lords and ladies, and people walk around and poof, in wigs, powdered wigs, and speaking to each other, this kind of thing that made themselves feel a little more superior than to those little monkeys and those dark-skinned colored people that they ruled. I mean, it was obvious. They were the, quote, chosen people. The truth of the matter was they were leveraging paper money to dominate the rest of the world. Now, as long as the system expanded sufficiently to pay off compounding debts, they did great. This lasted until 1850. 150 years after they started, England reached the limit. In the mid-19th century, the English Empire basically had gotten as big as it was going to get. It couldn't get any further. They sucked up, they ate up India. They went into China. They fought an opium war with China, forcing the Chinese to take opium. Why? Because the Chinese had silk, they had porcelain, and they had tea. Now the British, the very, very wealthy British people, they had an appetite. They were wealthy people. They had an appetite for the finer things in life. They had an appetite for tea, 4 o'clock tea. Every day it was a tradition, They liked silks, of course, fine garments. And they liked porcelain, teacups, all right, chinaware, all right. Now, the English just didn't want to pay with this with gold and silver. The Chinese said, no, you want our teas, you want our silver, you want our porcelain, we'll give it to you. You just got to pay us in silver, in bullion, all right. What happened is, that's when the trade started out of China. And silver started flowing into China from the West. The British had to pay good money for the silver to give to the Chinese. So much so, the British got uptight. They didn't have to do this with anybody else, all right? But they had to do it with the Chinese. Why? The Chinese had the silver. I mean, they had the porcelain, had the tea, and had the fine silks. So they had to do it with the Chinese because it was the only source. So what they thought, no, we keep giving them this expensive silver. We got to do something so we don't have to give. We're going to bankrupt ourselves. We're going to live beyond our means. So what the British did, they went in there, they fought what they called the Opium's War with China. The Chinese lost, and the British started exporting into China opium, which the Chinese got addicted to against the Chinese will. They broke the Chinese will with their gunboats, and pretty soon the Chinese, addicted to opium, were taking all this opium, and the British were able to get their tea, their porcelain, and their silks out of China without giving them costly silver. Now, who piggybacked on this? With the Americans. The Americans, the Yankee Clippers, made fortunes taking opium back and forth into China. I mean, just goods. The Americans piggybacked what the British had done. All right? But here we had the transition of power. Because what you had was, all of a sudden, England couldn't get any more countries. They couldn't suck up. They couldn't take down China. They got them addicted, but they couldn't own China. All right, they couldn't militarily defeat them. It was just too vast. They couldn't do this to Russia. All right, but they wanted to. So what happened is both Russia and China went communist. What was communism? They made it up. It didn't even exist. Like banking didn't exist before the 1700s, communism didn't exist before the next century. It was an off-the-shelf, made-up system that said if we made it equal, everything would work. Well, the truth of the matter is, it wouldn't work. You can't make everything equal. You have a marketplace. The British, what they had done was, they cleverly disguised their marketplace as being free, with paper coupons, with paper money. If paper money, the British paper money, could buy you what gold and silver other people had to pay, you were ahead of the game, because you could print paper, the other people had to earn it. This is why the British took over the world. This is why capitalism is unfair. Everybody thinks capitalism has to do with free markets. No, that's a myth that the capitalists want you to believe. Capitalism has to do with the distortion of free markets with debt-based paper capital, paper money, that central banks produce. The distortion of capitalism on free markets is extraordinary. When people can come into the free market, print paper as real money, you have a demand on the system that didn't exist before, and you have debts. Totally distorts free markets. We have an absolutely imbalanced and distorted economy today, and that's why it's failing. Now, what happened is that when the British Empire could no longer expand enough to pay off the debts, the British Empire started going down. What you see today in England is a shadow of itself. It started falling after 1850. All right? In 1870, for the first time, the British had a negative balance of trade. By the early part of the 20th century, the British Empire was over. The Americans exactly mirrored what the British did. What happened is the British bankers, the European bankers, came over and put in America the same central bank that the British had since 1695. Americans were free from this kind of economic tyranny before 1913. The Federal Reserve is a carbon copy of the Bank of England. Debt-based money, capital, became supplanted by the U.S. dollar, which before was issued by the U.S. Treasury. After that, it's all issued by the Federal Reserve. And now we have debt-based money with the same cancer happening in America, the same addictive cancer. Now, what happened is that the British Empire started collapsing, and the American Empire, it was great. We started expanding. Why? Because the rest of the world was having these huge wars. They destroyed each other, and we were the big boy in the block left standing. All right, at 1950, 100 years after the British had their peak of power, the United States had their peak of power. But just like Britain, 100 years in 1870, the British trade balance went negative. In 1970s, the U.S. trade balance went negative. And by the end of the century, just like the British had lost a tremendous amount of their power, and the next century was going to just sweep away what power the British had, this is happening to the United States. The end of the 1990s, the United States was a mere shadow economically of what it had been mere 40 years before. Now we are on the ropes. We're essentially a dead man walking. The debts that the capitalist system produces are so great that we can no longer pay them off. We don't have an empire like Britain had, though we do have the military costs necessary to support that empire. The military cost of the United States is what destroyed America. America, we hear all this talk about entitlements, and I tell you, we can't afford the entitlements the way they are. We can't afford it because they set it up this way to bankrupt the country. But the truth of the matter is, what bankrupted the country at first, and which bankrupted the country now, is military spending. Just like the British, just like government, just wanted to expand, and empire, power. The Americans, once they had this nasty little advantage in their hand called a central bank, did the same thing with it. The United States now is a shadow of what it once was, though it doesn't yet recognize it. In the early 1900s, Britain still thought they were a world power. They still had Union in South Africa. They still had, they still had India, the crown jewel in their empire. But the truth of the matter is, if you ran the numbers, England was a dead man walking in terms of the empire that it had previously. So it is with the United States. It's just a matter of time until America fails. When empire, the cost of empire takes America down just like it did England. Now, here we are. This is 2011. We're looking at this. We're looking at this thing, wondering what happened. Where are we going to go from here? Well, I'll tell you what happened. And I just told you that the bankers put their little game in there, a game that's so powerful that over time they made bank off of entrepreneurs, off of business, off of government spending, off of consumers. They take their cut from everybody. If you wanted to buy a house, they take their cut. You buy a house, you spend $100,000 a house, you're going to spend $250,000 in addition on interest. That's stunning. Stunning. You buy a house for $100,000. Over the life of the period of that 30-year fixed loan, you're going to pay $250,000 in interest. In interest that on money that they made up out of thin air. Thin air. All right? With pennies on the dollar. And Americans, they're blaming China, they're blaming this president, they're blaming entitlements, they're blaming everything except the bankers that have done this to them. All right? Now, I've watched this for around 30 years, 40 years, and it started making sense to me, and it became appalling because nobody understood it. Everybody's going around and human nature is a funny thing. As long as you can get from today to tomorrow, people don't like to think. They don't like to question the world that they're in. All right? Their feeling is, well, we've made it this far, we can make it further. All right? And that's what's happened to the whole world. I mean, China, which invented paper money in the year 1000, went through 5 dynasties, failed each time, finally in the 1600s outlawed paper money, now is printing more paper money than any country on the face of the earth. They're back into it. The United States, which fought the kind of paper money, and England's central bank fought a revolution to get away from it. Andrew Jackson kicked out the Bank of the United States, an attempt by banking interests to insidiously put a capital-based bank in the United States. They failed. They came back in 1913. They did it. It's been 98 years. We're only 2 years away from the 100th anniversary of the Federal Reserve. I don't know how long it's going to take for the Federal Reserve to totally destroy the chance of this country ever rebuilding itself. All right? We're into it for 98 years. Now, I've been looking at this for a little while, longer than I like to think. It wasn't obvious in the beginning, and it became obvious after a period of time. And I would say that we don't have much time left. I think that I don't care who you are watching this. I don't care what you're doing for a living. I don't care if you have a job. I don't care if you have a college degree. I don't care if you have a high school degree. I don't care if you dropped out in 3rd grade. You have very little understanding of how this game has happened and who's done it to you. But let me tell you something. You don't have to understand addiction until you become an addict. You don't have to understand what the AIDS virus does to die from AIDS. You don't have to understand capitalism to die from the banker's system that sucks every piece of profit, every piece of endeavor by charging interest and monetizing your entire life for life as you know it to be enjoyable to disappear. There's not much time left. And I don't know how much you realize the truth of those words.